Well, good evening. I am Andre Johnson. I am the Associate Professor of Communication and the Scholar in Resident at the Benjamin L. Hooks Institute for Social Change at Memphis, Tennessee. In Memphis, Tennessee, at the University of Memphis. We are so pleased tonight to have a group of scholars that are going to present the title, The Contours and Configurations of Black Religious Rhetoric. We are so excited about this panel, and I'm going to tell you more about the panel and more about what it is that we are trying to do here at the Center of African American Rhetoric and Public Address. But before I do any of that, I would like to turn it over now to my good friend, my classmate, and rhetoric homiletician par excellence. I'm so glad that he was able to join us on tonight and just share a few words before we officially get started. The Reverend Dr. Frank Anthony Thomas. So Dr. Thomas, thank you again for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for just this wonderful privilege. And it is exciting to see a vision unfold. Many of you probably will not know we were in class together. Both of us graduated 2008, I believe, from the Rhetoric program with Michael Charles Leff as our mentor. And so we'd be in class together and dreaming about, the possibilities between theology and rhetoric. And so it's a real privilege to see this come to be. And I believe that one of our most important scholars in the country is Dr. Andre Johnson, and proud to be associated with his work and see him on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, everything he's doing it. We call him the Lil Wayne of rhetoric. He's out there doing it. So I learned that tonight. Lil Wayne gives mixtapes every week. So thank you, Dr. Fisher. At any rate, we are proud. Our Dean, Aaliyah Gunning Francis, is on the line. We appreciate that. We are from Christian Theological Seminary, and three of our presenters tonight are in our PhD in African American Preaching and Sacred Rhetoric program. Brother Richard Gray and Janae Pitts-Murdock are in cohort 1, and Moy Harris in cohort 2. We have 21 PhD students working their way through the process in 2 cohorts, and I'm just excited to see a vision that Andre and I talked about to come to be, and with another generation of students who are probably smarter than we are, wiser than we are, and so they'll far outdistance what we're able to produce, and we're excited about it. So we just look forward. This is Christian Theological Seminary. We have a PhD program in African American Preaching and Sacred Rhetoric. You can look us up at cts.edu and check us out. And it's just my privilege. So I've got my questions already written out. I'm just waiting for them to finish the presentations to give you all a flavor of what it's like to be in a PhD program. We ain't playing. We are not playing. These some serious scholars here. So Dr. Johnson, I give it back to you, and I look forward to what's getting ready to happen. Thank God. I'm ready. Got my pen. See this? It's red. This is red ink too. Red ink too.
Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord. Again, I just want to thank Dr. Thomas for coming and sharing about CTS's program in rhetoric, sacred rhetoric, and African American preaching, and being a part of this continuing dialogue as we talk about Black rhetorical and public address tradition. Let me shout out another school who is helping us host tonight, Memphis Theological Seminary. Dr. Pete Gackey is the dean there. When I approached him about the possibility of doing this, he not only jumped on it, but he was so supportive in making this happen. And he has extended his hand into future projects. So I would love to see Dr. Frank, and then we got Dean Francis on as well. I would love to see a MTS-CTS connection, doing some sort of workshop or seminar in the near future as well. So Again, I am grateful and thankful for all of you. And thank you for joining. I am told that we had close to 200 people who pre-registered for this event. We have roughly about 90 folk and plus our panelists that are on right now, and more people should be coming on as we go. We are live streaming, so if you can catch the stream on my page, please click the share button or just get the URL and share it so that people can see that we are live on Facebook. And please share this on Twitter and your other social media outlets as well. Philip S. Foner and Robert James Brantham, in their important anthology of African-American speeches, Lift Every Voice, wrote that oratory remains the pervasive and important practice in American political and social life. They argued that oratory is still the basic tool of organizing, the crown of ceremonial observance, the currency of advocacy and deliberation. For them, oratory helps to identify group interests and helps these groups mobilize for action. It is through oratory, they argued, that profound differences may be understood and grievances and dissent may be brought face to face with audiences responsible for injustice. Since before the founding of what would become the United States of America, African Americans' use of oratory and public address has been paramount to their survival in a country that has consistently deemed them second-class citizens. Through powerful sermons, speeches, and spoken word performances, African Americans not only been able to comfort and encourage their own communities, but also to cast a vision of what America could become. Recently, the scholarship in our field have reflected this importance. After a growth spurt in the 60s and early 70s, and after small research done in the 80s and 90s and at the beginning of the new millennium, recent scholarship has come back to the African-American voice and the African-American rhetorical and public address tradition. For instance, Sean Perry Giles and Michael Hogan, in their Handbook of Rhetoric and Public Address, published 2 essays that focus on the African-American public address tradition. Rhetoric Review devoted an entire issue that focused on the rhetorical legacy of Frederick Douglass. The editors of the Handbook of Research on Black Males devoted the first section, titled History, to African-American public address essays edited by Bernard Duffy. There have been anthologies of African-American speeches such as Richard Lehman's and Bernard Duffy's The Will of the People, a critical anthology of great African-American speeches in 2012. Full-length treatments on books such as my own, The Forgotten Prophet, Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, and the African-American prophetic tradition. Megan Parker Brooks, A Voice That Could Stir an Army, Fannie Lou Hamer and the Rhetoric of the Black Freedom Movement. Kimberly P. Johnson's The Womanist Preacher, Proclaiming Womanist Rhetoric from the Pulpit. And yes, my own recent work, No Future in This Country, The Prophetic Pessimism of Bishop Henry McNeil Turner. Add to this the plethora of journal articles, digital humanities websites devoted to the speeches of African-American figures, and the attention that many in our field are now paying to the intersection of rhetoric, race, and religion. The African-American oratorical and public address tradition is indeed enjoying a renaissance of sorts. However, we contend that there is still much we can do and much we must do within the field. We here at the Center of African-American Rhetoric and Public Address, and with the help of the Department of the Communication and Film Department at the University of Memphis, we attempted to address this by sponsoring a National Communication Association pre-conference in 2019, titled Yet With a Steady Beat, Creating and Sustaining the African-American Public Address Tradition. The one-day conference of 4 panel presentations and a roundtable discussion was indeed a success. Made up of senior and junior scholars and graduate students studying the Black rhetoric and public address tradition. We examine the role of politics and protest, religious rhetoric, womanist rhetorical theory and criticism, and charted future directions of the field. The conference was not meant just to be a one-day event. We wanted to do a follow-up conference with a publication of the proceedings and to schedule more conferences. We began to envision what the center would look like as time went on. However, much of our planning and visioning began to slow down and eventually halted because of COVID-19. We had already planned to have another one-day conference when NCA met in Indianapolis, and we had even secured to have a place to have the event. Light of the World Christian Church, where one of our panelists, Janae Pitts-Murdock, serves as senior pastor. Needless to say, we did not get to go to Indy last year, so we postponed our conference and decided to offer a symposium instead. And in this first symposium, we wanted to put together a panel that would highlight up and coming scholarship within the field of Black rhetoric and public address. More importantly, we wanted to also highlight some graduate students and emerging professors who are doing important work in the field of Black religious rhetoric. And I do believe we have some of those people with us tonight. As you will note from these presentations, the field of Black rhetoric and public address is not only growing, but is also thriving. From the pulpit oratory and brilliance of C.L. Franklin, and how he explores and examines Black power to help move the masses to equality and freedom, to the, for many, obscure rhetorical deftness and pulpit eloquence of United Methodist minister Robert Dungy and how he navigated being a Black face in white space, to expanding the Black rhetorical tradition to include DJs, providing space and place to create a virtual and viral atmosphere where many found comfort and reassurance during a pandemic, to blazing a path in our understanding of the Black rhetorical and homiletical tradition that unapologetically moves us away from just a dangerous sermon, but calls our attention to a hermeneutical design that will produce sermon militancy that is necessary for any Black liberation project. I think you all agree that these budding scholars are on to something. So if you are like me, you can't wait to hear them. So guess what? I'll shut up right now. Thank you. So with that as a general introduction, we will get started with doctoral candidate, Janae Pitts-Murdock, and her presentation.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you to our moderator, Dr. Andre Johnson, and to my fellow scholar panelists. Thank you to the Center for the Study of African American Rhetoric and Public Address and Memphis Theological Seminary for the opportunity to present Black liberation rhetoric and Christian proclamation, Reverend C.L. Franklin, and the meaning of Black power. My talk explores the intersections of Black power rhetoric and the African American pulpit as witnessed in the preaching of Reverend C.L. Franklin, one of America's foremost folk preachers. Using Franklin's sermon, The Meaning of Black Power, as the rhetorical artifact of investigative inquiry, I analyze how Franklin articulates Black power conceptions in content and form. Franklin's treatment of Black power confronts the complexities of the term while displaying the brilliance of his rhetorical artistry. My analysis contributes to the scarce scholarship on Franklin's rhetoric and indirectly responds to critiques of his antipathy to radical Black political rhetoric. Mining more deeply into my rhetorical analysis, in February 1969, during New Bethel Baptist Church's observance of Negro History Week and Negro History Month, Reverend C.L. Franklin delivered a three-part sermon series. The sermons were entitled, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, I Heard It Through the Grapevine, and The Meaning of Black Power. These sermons aimed to stimulate racial pride, renew commitment to the civil rights movement, and interpret the African American experience through a biblical hermeneutic of liberation. Despite widespread frustration in the African American community, marked by recent uprisings in more than 100 cities in 67 and 68, Franklin's symbolic sermons during Negro History Week and Negro History Month in February of 69 called his audiences toward a higher mode beyond anger, beyond frustration, beyond violence, toward one of self-determination, political advocacy, and racial pride, which Franklin intimates are inextricably linked to the cosmic ideal of freedom and liberation inherent in God's creation. Franklin's rhetorically constituted audience is not necessarily Christian, but undoubtedly sympathetic toward the plight of Black Americans. Throughout the sermon, Franklin illumines the oppressive Negro experience, from the violent aggression and assault by civil rights opponents to the denial of fundamental human freedoms. Franklin offers logical and emotional proofs to emphasize the unacceptable and indefensible condition of African American life in America. Franklin invokes the memory of numerous Black thought leaders and civil rights leaders such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Frederick Douglass, Thurgood Marshall, Marcus Garvey, and Martin Luther King Jr. And Franklin references multiple publications by Black authors, including Martin Luther King's Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, and Chuck Stone's Tell It Like It Is. Interesting, Franklin's rhetorically constituted audience is male-centered. While it is plausible that many, if not most, of the worshipers in the sanctuary that night were women, Franklin's male-centered word choice and thematic emphases exclude women from fully envisioning and participating in his conception of Black power. His exclusive use of male-centered language and the absence of female-centered language in his conception of Black power, which happens to be dedicated to all thinking people, inscribes the marginality, if not erasure, of women. His rhetorically constituted audience prioritizes the humanity, needs, and experiences of Black men and enables the marginalization and near erasure of women. Franklin not only excludes women's identity in his rational conception of Black power, he also denies women's voices to be heard. Specifically, the absence of women in the examples of civil rights leaders and of Black intellectuals is also an overt dismissal of women's contribution to African American progress. Rhetorically speaking, Black men are the second persona, those welcomed or invited into the discourse. Black women are the third persona, those negated or objectified in a way that the second persona is not. Whether Franklin consciously intended to exclude Black women in his conception of Black power is unknown. What is evident, however, is his conscious inclusion of Black men. Notably, however, Franklin introduces the Black power idea through the words of Martin Luther King, whom he calls the beloved and lamented. The lengthy introduction excerpted from King's Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, clarifies the connection between the Black power term and all other civil rights groups and immediately sanitizes it of its violent associations. The excerpt, while providing insightful details, also enables C.L. Franklin to assume the benefits of King's credibility and rhetorical mastery. Within the first 5 minutes of Franklin's discourse, he interjects King's name and reiterates Martin Luther King as a narrator 4 times. Franklin mitigates aversion to the Black power concept by acknowledging real or perceived tension in the environment and opens a pathway for listeners to engage the topic with less resistance. Reducing resistance to the concept is essentially increasing the listener's competency and ability to act. Franklin dislodges Black nationalism as a necessary condition of Black power. if the Black power concept is a site of communal discord due to its unchallenged association with Black nationalism, Franklin extricates the source of contention. His word choice not only creates distance between Black power and Black nationalism, but Franklin characterizes any equivalence of the two concepts as stretching the meaning of Black power. Franklin directly and definitively disrupts the unchallenged assumption that Black power and Black nationalism are linked. Franklin operates within a constrained, although loosely constrained, discursive environment. He's bound by the interacting expectations inherent in the multiple traditions in which he operates. Franklin chooses the degree of influence each of his traditions bears on his sermon and risks sermon effectiveness should his choices not overcome the resistance in the audience. Franklin's sermon was likely delivered during an evening broadcast at New Bethel Baptist Church, the church he pastored at the time. So not only is he navigating the tradition, the Christian tradition that he practices in, but now he is also navigating congregational energy because his sermon was delivered during an evening broadcast at either 8, 9, or 10 o'clock in the evening. Franklin is also navigating his reputation as a folk preacher. His antecedent ethos as a riveting and inspiring preacher of the Black Baptist folk tradition complicates the persona he adopts in this sermon. As an established figure in the folk preaching tradition, Franklin is expected to dazzle his listeners with imaginative storytelling and reinterpretation of the biblical story, consummated in a rhythmic and melodious climax. But here, Franklin is adopting a persona that adopts authority and Black liberation rhetoric. Michael Leff insists that rhetorical excellence cannot be reduced to mere success in pleasing or persuading an audience, but rather its realization demands self-restraint, breadth of knowledge, and a cultivated sense of moral character. I assert that Franklin demonstrates rhetorical excellence because he indeed practices self-restraint, breadth of knowledge, and a cultivated sense of the common good in this sermon. His use of rhetorical devices becomes more pronounced and more frequent as he progresses into his climax and conclusion, which brings us to his rhetorical signature. These devices aid in Franklin's pacing of ideas and in his evoking audience participation. Franklin relies on the repetition of particular devices that render his discourse most effective. Many scholars and preaching practitioners attribute Franklin's soul-stirring climax to his controlled use of melody and tonal force, familiarly understood as hooping. Martha Simmons describes Franklin as the ultimate melodic hooper whose voice was explosive and filled with a river of music. She says so many have tried to imitate his hoop that Franklin has likely cloned more hoopers than any preacher of the 20th century. While Franklin's vocal control is advanced and effective in this sermon, it is not the height of his climax. Franklin coalesces the strategic repetition of rhetorical devices, melody, and tonal force. What makes his hoop distinctive and effective is this strategic repetition, and he enacts what's called the hooping curve until he reaches the ideal pitch for maximum endurance. Careful analysis reveals that Franklin diversifies the rhetorical devices he uses, and he typically overlaps the one with the other into his next device. And when Franklin finally settles into the final phases of his climax, his syllables become elongated and the frequency of his use of repetitive devices, it increases. Franklin's rhetorical signature can be described as the dynamic combination of his preferred rhetorical devices and hoop. Franklin's preferred rhetorical devices lend itself to this tonal force and the impact of his climactic system. He adeptly manipulates these rhetorical devices and his hoop to intensify sermonic content and eventual celebration. The distinctiveness of this rhetorical signature garners Franklin's international acclaim as one of the world's greatest and most celebrated preachers. But our concern also centers on how Franklin's sermon troubles the dominant conception of Christian proclamation. Absent a few references to scripture and a brief reference to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, this sermon lacks the expected marks of Christian proclamation. Here, Franklin, for him, Black power is the guiding idea. This sermon is not shaped as an invitation into deeper mysteries of God or to disclose the nature of God. However, he uses scripture and theological reflection as the undergirding foundation. Consider that the meaning of Black power has the silhouette of Christian proclamation. It's delivered on a Sunday evening during a worship service in a sanctuary by a church's pastor. But one would wonder whether it meets the defined characteristics of Christian proclamation. We have the scholarship of Barbara Brown Taylor, who says that clergy are living libraries of God's word, and our stories are God's stories. Brown Taylor contends that Christian proclamation is not judged solely by the content of the message, but also the nature of the relationship between preacher and God. Brown Taylor affirms that clergy are God's representative to the congregation. The preacher speaks that which enables the congregation to have an encounter with God, and that which reveals God's activity. Here we find in Franklin's sermon the meaning of Black power, the clarification in the ways Black power is consistent with God's ideal for creation and manifests Christ's liberating work in the world. For Franklin, this indeed meets the mark for Christian proclamation. For it is Christ's sacrifice, which is the preamble and compelling factor for Black liberation. Black liberation and its Black power rhetoric are outgrowths of Christ's first act of salvation. Franklin thinks about Black power in theological terms. And while he is talking about Black power in words, he is doing Black power through theology. Franklin leverages the curiosity and the interest around Black power operating in the environment to spread a theopolitical conception of Black power that reflects God's liberating hope for creation. Although he excludes Black women as full participants and benefactors of his Black power conception, through his dynamic coalescence of rhetorical devices, proofs, and appeals, he produces an inspiring experience at the intersection of race, rhetoric, and religion.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. Next up is Richard Bray.
Let me see slides. Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. And in the spirit of all preachers and gathering clergy when there are multiple speakers at one occasion, the protocol has been set. So again, my name is Richard Bray. I'm a PhD candidate, and the title of my presentation is Affirmed in Word and Deed. I'm gonna begin just a little bit differently than the good Reverend Dr. Janae, because we are in a PhD program. I wanted to make sure that the audience understood how I got to where I am today. Because what we understand is the program in African American preaching and sacred rhetoric considers three things to be foundational to our learning. First of all is theology, who you know to God to be. Also preaching or homiletics, both in terms of the arc of preaching holistically, beginning with European, and also situating the Black preaching tradition within preaching itself. And also the argument that scholars have between rhetoric and preaching, and is rhetoric necessary? I believe that rhetoric is necessary in preaching, because preaching is humans talking to humans. And because humans are speaking to humans, we are seeking to persuade them of something. In preaching, I believe, and many others, that preaching seeks to persuade someone about their belief about God. Dr. Frank Anthony Thomas uses theology and homiletics as a metaphor of dance, with theology being the lead partner. But the way that you understand it is the way that the preacher presents it. So to that end, when homiletics and theology come together, comes your own preaching theory. I have developed my own preaching theory entitled communal homiletic. Communal homiletic is positioned in two distinct claims. It first declaims the African philosophy of Ubuntu. Ubuntu is I am because we are. It is a sense of personhood. And this sense of personhood affirms the sacredness of all of humanity. In Christian speech, it then refers to people made in the image of God, or imago Dei. Second of all, communal homiletic asserts the second assertion, that preaching is formation. In other words, that a preacher will call, rhetoric acts as a place to call people together, and over time, they are formed into something. Preaching does that. I believe it creates a homiletic community. I believe that preaching encourages hearers of the gospel to share God's grace, love, and mercy where in the places where people live, learn, work, worship, and play. For faith without works is dead. Not only does the communal homiletic affirm the sacredness of individuals, but it is preaching that shapes a community of faith that aims to live into the gospel through God's love, grace, mercy, and justice. And this type of communal homiletic preaching is known by its moral, ethical, and theological commitments to justice, freedom, equity, and hospitality. So as a part of my dissertation, what I'm thinking about is exploring the cross-racial and cross-ethnic open itinerancy appointments in the United Methodist Church. I want to explore the rhetoric found in sermons from an itinerant elder who was committed to creating multi-ethnic congregation to help my reader understand the hopes and challenges of such an endeavor. I am using manuscripts from Reverend Dr. Robert Dungy, who was an itinerant elder. He lived until 2014. And the sermons that I will use in my dissertation research is a 2-year time frame between 1987 and 1989, when he was appointed to Sunnycrest United Methodist Church in Indiana. The methodology that I'm using is rhetorical criticism, both in terms of close reading and understanding what's happening, and also using secondarily critical discourse analysis, because I'm interested in the ways that power plays out in the text and across his preaching. So a couple of things that are happening within Affirmed in Word and Deed. Not only is Dungy a cross-racial appointment, meaning that Dungy, as an African-American man, is appointed by the bishop and the district superintendent in council with the local pastoral search committee to be appointed to a predominantly white congregation. Not only does this speak to Black leadership, but I believe that part of the discourse that is contained within Affirmed in Word and Deed is transformational discourse. Within the text, there is a moral and ethical and theological imperative, and it begins to focus on Jesus, because Jesus is the model in which the church, as well as United Methodism and the Church Universal, sees as the way that it points towards inclusion. In the sermon, Dungy uses 1 John 1 and 4 as a way to point to the apostolic witness of what they witnessed directly with Jesus. Not only does that, but he also refers to the fellowship that not only the apostles had among themselves, but also with Jesus. And because of this, because of the apostolic witness, they are then, their witness is, their experience is affirmative in what we are to do as followers of Jesus and as Christians. Not only is this sermon about radical transformation, but it's really about how do you change personal and social identity toward the resocialization into God's family. Because we have to remember that Dungy was preaching at a time when the United Methodist Church had on its book the mandate for inclusion along with policy, but did not yet do it. So with this being his first appointment, he begins to explore what it means to that. And the thing that he hangs his hat on is his personal experience. Throughout the sermon is this theme of experience of Jesus, experience of the disciples, experience of himself, and the experience of the bishop and the district superintendent. And throughout the text, he relies on the experience, and he throws this, this rhetorical line and asks the audience, would they trust the experience of Jesus, the apostles, and the bishop in order to affirm the appointment that this is where they should be now in the life of their in the life of their congregation. What has been interesting, in order to create an inclusive church or multi-ethnic, multicultural congregation, there has to be a way in which people can see themselves as a part of it. So what I see in Affirmed in Word and Deed is the repeated use of inclusive language, such as us, you and I, fellowship, and heirs, as well as sharing ministry together. These words around inclusive invites the listeners to see themselves as a part of this new radical transformation. What makes it difficult for the people is that they've never done it before. So the persona that Dungy adopts in this sermon is not only an experienced, open itinerant elder, but someone, he adopts the persona of a brother who happens to be Black, which is significantly orients the audience to be different. Because what he does in the sermon is not only display his experience, but also talks about the things that make him human. And one of those is humor. And so then throughout the sermon, he then uses John 1:1-4. And then what's interesting, he then goes to Ephesians 2:14 to talk about that there's no barrier that that separates us. He uses in his text a wonderful illustration about an 18-inch wall that served in the Second Temple as an indication of something so small as 18 inches had divided Jewish and Gentile worshipers. And then he compares that to the small thing of race and gender as dividing us, but that we should be united as Christians of those that are following it. And because this is the first time that Sunnycrest United Methodist Church has a Black elder as their pastor, he wants to then imbue or impart a hopeful spirit. And by doing that, he uses rhetoric of being on a journey and being exciting, but also, again, pointing to this being his fourth racial appointment. And so that's my presentation. Thank you so much.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I know we're going to have some questions and some comments for that theoretical framework that you've come up with. This is just great. Next up, Moya Harris.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for your scholarship and your opportunity to be on this panel. Thank you to Dr. Thomas for your support and letting us know that you have your red pen out. Thank you so much for that. And greetings to my Dean Leah Gunning Francis, and a shout out to the second cohort of the African American Preaching and Sacred Rhetoric program. My paper is entitled, "Last Night, a DJ Saved My Life: The Theoretical Nature of Club Quarantine." The challenges of COVID-19 pandemic have challenged American life. Communities of faith in general, and the Black church in particular, have had to rethink weekly engagement and worship formats during a time of social distancing. Basically, the church has had to reimagine worship and congregational engagement. I would argue that a crisis brought about by a highly contagious virus that has shut down the economy and threatened life and limb has forced churches to reevaluate their mission. I would also argue that this moment has caused individuals to search for hope and reassurance in unprecedented ways, calling for a creative and authentic theoretical response. As a minister and a registered nurse working in a hospital last year, my viewpoint of the pandemic has been multifaceted. It caused me to face my own mortality. I had dreams about bringing the virus home and infecting my family, and it all began to take a toll on me. As a preacher, there were times when virtual church and virtual sermons were not a healing balm. When people are faced with crisis, the search for the sacred is intensified. I missed physical church. I missed being with people. I missed hearing a sermon from the pulpit. I was scared and I was stressed out of my mind. I needed a word from God to sustain me, to encourage me, to remind me that I was not alone, and I doubt that I am alone. I needed to re-examine and even redefine what I considered sacred. The sacred secular dichotomy that is often taught by the Black church has made it difficult for some churches to pivot into a virtual reality. There are two sides to this argument. One school of thought acknowledges that there is a tension between the sacred and the secular, believing that popular or secular music is diametrically opposed to sacred music. However, some scholars argue that there is no separation between the two realms, especially when it comes to Black music. Teresa L. Reed claims that this dichotomy is relatively new in African American culture, despite what many churches have articulated. Within West African culture, there is no distinction between religion and other aspects of human existence, unlike a distinct separation in Western European culture. Music permeates all aspects of life. The dichotomy was taken up by Black people after being exposed to Western European culture. However, despite the ongoing crisis, despite the social distancing, despite the need for virtual church, I argue that fresh rhetorical moments are emerging that have provided glimpses of God's hope, joy, and love. I also argue that these God encounters do not always have to occur in a church context. During the pandemic, virtual DJ sessions on social media have emerged, creating community and sacred spaces of healing, which I believe warrants a scholarly examination from a theo-rhetorical perspective. By theo-rhetorical, I mean a persuasion that is God-centered. Virtual spaces like Club Quarantine that was created by DJ Derek Jones, professionally known as D-Nice, has created a sacred space on Instagram. I would like to make the claim that the DJ in this instance is grounded both theologically and anthropomorphically, being a griot of both the sacred and the secular. The message is found in the music. It was in this sacred space that I found community, joy, and love. And it is from this perspective that I dared to make the proclamation that a DJ saved my life. D-Nice was the preacher, and I was one amongst a congregation of people seeking some sense of normalcy in a world that was constantly changing. The music became the sermon. The music gave me hope and let me know that God is indeed with me. Club Quarantine became my church. Therefore, because of the communal and sacred nature of Club Quarantine, I chose to examine its theo-rhetorical significance during the COVID-19 pandemic. Writing this paper helped me to reconnect to God when I couldn't hear God's voice. This sacred space has used the rhetoric of music to spread messages of hope, love, and resilience, and created a safe space that formed community. That being said, the aim of my paper is to show that there is no separation between the sacred and the secular, to show the rhetorical nature of theology, and to show the sacredness of Club Quarantine. Structurally, in order to support my thesis, I of course wrote my introduction. I defined and discussed rhetorical theology, mostly using Dr. Andre Johnson's article, The Prophetic Persona of James Cone and the Rhetorical Theology of Black Theology. I then defined theomusicology and discussed the sacred secular dichotomy using John Michael Spencer's Theological Music, Introduction to Theomusicology, as my main source, alongside the work of hip hop scholar Daniel White Hodge, who also uses Spencer's work. And then I briefly discussed the relationship between homiletics and Black music. Black preachers often connected various genres of Black music in the crafting of the sermon. There's a plethora of scholars who have written on this. This is how I transitioned into the conversation about rap music and hip hop culture. And finally, my conclusion is entitled The Club Quarantine Phenomenon and the Homiletical Moment. In this section, I deal with whether Club Quarantine can be defined as a homiletical moment. Tonight, I am just going to discuss the section on rhetorical theology, which is foundational to my argument. To understand rhetorical theology, it must be understood that rhetoric and theology are dance partners, as we have already heard tonight, in the words of Dr. Frank A. Thomas. Black preaching is inherently rhetorical. The preacher is trying to convince the audience to believe or to act in a particular manner. Rhetoric, as defined by Carlin Coolers Campbell, is the study of all the processes by which people influence each other through symbols, regardless of the intent or the source. And then Daniel Migliore, who wrote Faith Seeking Understanding, says that crises will cause people to search for theological meaning in new ways. And he uses the World Trade Center and Pentagon attacks on September 11th as an example of how people sought God in different ways. During a crisis, we seek God in different places and in unorthodox ways. Going deeper into the idea of rhetorical theology, Dr. Thomas, in Introduction to the Practice of African-American Preaching, discusses Maurice Charlin's constitutive rhetoric, where the speaker's ideology creates or shapes the audience. I would argue that just as a preacher shapes the audience with the purpose of getting the congregation to act and believe in a particular way, D-Nice has done similarly by forming the people of Club Quarantine. He gave the people a reason to stay home, preventing the spread of the coronavirus, as well as created a holy place where soulful music was played night after night. Continuing on with the argument that theology and rhetoric are partners, Dr. Andre Johnson, in The Prophetic Persona of James Cone and the Rhetorical Theology of Black Theology, states that rhetorical theology is attentive to the ways an audience within a particular context is persuaded or moved to act. Context is key. He says that rhetoric finds its home within a particular situation and context. Johnson then goes on to say that all theology is at its core argument that seeks to persuade its hearers to a certain position. In other words, how we speak about God, how we articulate our faith, and how we attempt to persuade others about the things of God is rhetorical. Johnson maintains that rhetorical theology is focused on the actual implementation or acting out of theology rather than on the method. The text or the artifact influences or shapes the theory. In the instance of the rhetorical moment of Club Quarantine, I would argue that the music became the text, taking on the rhetorical task that guides the listeners through community and understanding. The context created the method and the moment. So, in conclusion, this notion of rhetorical theology can be applied to the need for a new rhetorical strategy in this season. How and where we articulate what is sacred should not be restricted to the traditions of the church. We need for these spaces to be obvious. The need for these spaces is obvious. The year of 2020 became the year of the DJ. Returning to the forefront, the DJ came to the forefront of hip hop culture. Other DJs like Ninth Wonder, Clark Kent, DJ Jazzy Jeff have faithful followings that play music that help people transcend time and space, even for a moment. Yes, a DJ still saves my life, and I'm still listening, I'm still worshiping, and I'm still hopeful in the midst of the pandemic. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Before we get to our next panelist, I do want to just shout out, I think he is in the Zoom room, one of the attendees. I want to shout out President of Memphis Theological Seminary, Jody Hill. Thank you, Brother President, for attending. I thought I saw you making some comments in the chat, and I just wanted to shout you out. And last, but definitely not least, Dr. Earl Fisher.
Well, good evening. Let me start by saying thanks for allowing me to participate. Let me also say that the Reverend Dr. Andre E. Johnson used to be my friend until he structured this panel in such a way that I have to come behind some of these powerful scholars in training. And so I thought my pastor, Dr. Frank Thomas, would have intervened, but clearly he is asleep at the wheel. So I'm gonna do the best I can with what I have, but I want to go on public record and say it is punishment. Okay, I know we ain't, but it's punishment to have to go after all of these preachers, these wonderful preachers. I want to take a few moments to try to introduce Sermonic Militancy, which is an essay that will be published in the Religion and Communication Journal. It's coming out in the fall of this year. It's a call towards more revolutionary homiletics and hermeneutics. So I'll just share a few of the sections. I was also worried about going over my time, but these scholars were so brief. I'm just going to reclaim whatever time they didn't take. And then if I go over, I'm good. Okay. There are actually 3 criteria that I want to try to argue for sermonic militancy, which is an attempt to try to differentiate and delineate between some of the more socially conscious rhetoric, prophecy or prophetic rhetoric proper, and something that I think is a little bit more liberationist than those other 2. And this is also drawing from a conversation on Dr. Thomas's trilogy, especially the first book in How to Preach a Dangerous Sermon. So here are the 3 criteria that I want to present for sermonic militancy, and then I'll share 2 sections from the essay. The criteria for sermonic militancy, as I see it, is 1, it's rhetoric that is sacred and grounded in an adequate reflection of the rhetor's experiences, biases, fears, convictions, and its relationship to the social, political, religious power dynamics where it is rhetorically invented and situated. 2, it's rhetoric that centers and prioritizes the voices, experiences, and needs of the most vulnerable and oppressed people. And 3rd, it is rhetoric that is, and I think this is critically important, unapologetically aggressive, not appealing to the deception of moderation or incrementalism. One of the sections in the essay is entitled The Rhetorical Tension Between Moralism and Militancy. The preface of Dr. Thomas's How to Preach a Dangerous Sermon provides right words from one of the most notable religious and rhetorical prophetic figures of our day, Bishop William Barber, orchestrator of the epic Moral Mondays movement, as former president of the North Carolina NAACP, current leader of the New Poor People's Campaign. Barber described how, quote, dangerous preaching is not simply a critique from below, exposing the limits and weaknesses of the ruling class. In every generation, prophets of God warn the oppressor and the oppressed, exposing systemic evil in the ways it traps each of us in its sinister patterns, quote. Now he continues, quote, dangerous preaching risks challenging those in power, but it also risks challenging the revolutionaries who would turn righteous indignation into hate, perpetuating the endless spiral of violence, end quote. Now, this admonishment highlights some of the limitations of how Dr. Thomas and Barber call forth our envisioning of the limits of moralism and militancy. The challenge here is the false binary of either a perceived moral righteous indignation, usually parenthetically tempered with a commitment to nonviolence, and a hate-filled militancy. When this false dichotomy is concretized and left unchecked, it hearkens the sentiments of those who seek to diffuse righteous indignation and identify Black rage rooted in Black suffering and pain as merely impulsive, uncalculated, unwarranted, misguided, or unjustified anger. This presumes prophetic fire limited to the constraints of nonviolence, but sermonic militancy is much more textured, complicated, and disruptive. Normative conventions like those offered by Barber in the passages above must submit to the exigencies of social and political context. Now, I do not believe Barber or Dr. Thomas intend to reinforce these contextual constraints. I don't think they mean to utilize the same boundaries that white and Black assimilationists demand be used, which limit the rhetorical and ideological capacity for freedom fighting and liberationist efforts. So this speaks to the subversive nature of white theological and rhetorical framing. It boxes us in unbeknownst to us. Therefore, we must highlight and affirm the rhetorical and existential realities whereby one can be righteously indignant and, due to the pressing and emergent need for change in the social order, be willing to embrace a more revolutionary posture that does not promote preemptive violence, but reserves the right to utilize whatever means necessary to secure one's survival, dignity, and hope. Militancy that does not reject violence is not rooted in the hatred of others. It is rooted in the love of oneself and the embrace of a depressing realism. Therefore, when bound by the limitations of Thomas, even when such sermonic material is dangerous and takes risk, the risks are subject to be so cautiously calculated that they transform into tools that can be manipulated by those rendered powerless, misleading them to presume power is achieved through political wizardry, politeness, and piety. The risks are ruled by constraints and tempered by conventions. However, the same tools used by the powerless can also be manipulated by those in positions of perceived power, making them appear to be more compassionate, politically aloof than they really are. Sermonic militancy recognizes what Barber calls the sinister patterns of systemic evil. Reaching further, sermonic militancy is not only a dangerous sermon, but any public speech that centers the immediacy of carnage, blood, terror, and evil, which can be turned on or off based upon our words. Moya, I'm thinking about your piece now. A sermon can be dangerous and still not be militant. Militancy is rooted in exigency. Militancy is keener on the severity of the oppression and its need to be uprooted sooner rather than later. It is not misguided in a belief that change will happen the moment the sermonically militant presentation is offered, yet time is not neutral. Time and appeals for patience, incrementalism, and moderation are often the foundations for maintaining inequity. The tension between moralism and militancy must be recognized even if it is not resolved. The fact is, appeals to religious moralism alone disassociated from the presence, or at least the perception of militancy, has not gotten Black people many liberties and social political progress in America. Furthermore, moralism alone is not honest enough to deal with the perils of social, political, and theological terrorism that pervades our world. We must be more realistic, holistic, and historical in our analyses. Liberation requires more than appeals to the angels within or amongst us. Power is much too static for it to be negotiated for, with benefits of the doubt being given to systems, structures, institutions, and individuals who have proven to be willing to play unfairly. Since evil has never been defeated by moralism nor militancy alone, we must choose to include radical and revolutionary ideals, appeals, and imaginations into our frameworks. To not do so is to prefer the ridiculous over the radical. I want to share this last section. It's entitled Sermonic Militancy as a More Precise Prophetic Rhetoric. Many scholars have undertaken the challenge of trying to define and contextualize prophecy, prophetic rhetoric, prophetic preaching, and what it means to speak truth to power. A few seminal works that overlap these themes are James Darcy's The Prophetic Tradition and Radical Rhetoric in America, Walter Brueggemann's The Prophetic Imagination, and Cornel West's Prophesied Deliverance. Each of these works are grounded in an engagement with prophecy that centers neo-Aristotelian and Eurocentric logic, sitting itself on the themes of ethos, pathos, and logos, although these ideas do not account for contemporary realities of race, gender, class, etc. And they privilege ideas from the Greco-Roman world as standardized or universal. As such, it places the Jihad as the primary framework and parahesia, or bolder frank speech, as the primary technique. These elements help us understand rhetorical appeals, persuade people in positions of authority to be more sensitive to moral claims for justice. And as courageous as these claims may be, they are far from complete if liberation is the end game. West builds upon these claims in his more recent work, Black Prophetic Fire, which concentrates on rhetorical strategies of several notable African-American figures in the fight for freedom and civil or human rights. These themes are expanded upon in the anthology by Martha Simmons and Frank Thomas, Preaching with Sacred Fire, which chronicles and highlights several Black preachers with various styles and substantive appeals to divine power and authority over the past several centuries. These works continue the trajectory of neo-Aristotelian norms and appeals to parahesia. More recently, David G. Holmes' book, Where the Sacred and Secular Harmonize, expands the boundaries of prophecy beyond the traditional pulpit platforms, and also, like Boris Nunley's book, Keeping It Hushed, builds upon a West African rhetorical device, nomo, that is better suited in delineating between rhetoric that is simply socially conscious or morally persuasive, and that which is socially just or sermonically militant. Holmes writes, quote, a salient component of West African spirituality is nomo. Rhetorical scholars recognize nomo as the power, energy, or life force of the world. For Africans taken from their motherland and dispersed across the diaspora, nomo encapsulated, indeed embodied, the wisdom of the ancestors, the will to strive, and the to bring liberation into existence, end quote. What Holmes does that helps sharpen what I'm meaning by sermonic militancy is use nomo as a rhetorical device which seeks to, quote, bring liberation into existence. Quote. The reality is too many contemporary claims and appeals to prophetic rhetoric are aligned with a modest reform or a reordering of an unjust system. These measures will not result in the liberation of the oppressed due to their fixation with moderation and incrementalism. Sermonic militancy is more than simple prophecy because it helps to shrink the time frame between articulation and actualization. Prophecy, most commonly understood, describes what is likely to happen in the future if nothing changes in the present. Parahesia and neo-Aristotelian rhetorical devices have too much stock in the luster of a governmental order that hinges on a moral center. Sermonic militancy is as much concerned about the present as it is the future. It does not bank on the benevolence of a political leader or system. Bold and frank speeches must be coupled with aggressive demands undergirded by righteous action. Sermonic militancy is akin to nomo and calls a people to an immediate and righteous or revolutionary action. Holmes goes on to contend, quote, nomo constitutes one link between Black religion and Black politics, end quote. And this is a pivotal link for understanding sermonic militancy. It is not hyper-spiritual language that can be easily co-opted by oppressive structures, rendering them guilty of nothing more than religious misinterpretation. Since all theology is political, sermonic militancy leans into the political theology, demands a radical political response to the immediacy of injustice. Lastly, as it relates to the benefits for the discussion on sermonic militancy, Holmes deals with necessary lines of demarcation between general prophecy, prophetic rhetoric, and the need for us to specify the differences between the various forms. He writes, quote, but prophets do more than speak against societal wrongs. They bear witness against those who do wrong and on behalf of the wronged. I think of those who do not have the political process, who do not have access to the political process, who lack the literacy or access to participate, and who will be ignored by those controlling the process. As a watch person, the prophet warns not of an inevitable future based on the nation's undesirable course of action, but a conditional one. Past injustices that have been institutionalized or ignored or both must be addressed. And this is one reason why prophets lament a nation's state. A lament rather than a celebrative song conveying tones of sorrow or narrow nostalgia or naive hope compels us to face harsh national realities with the determination to do something about them, even when the challenges appear irresolvable, end quote. Now, this clause captures the tone and tenor of sermonic militancy, which maintains hope that things may change for the better, yet it demands that the change take place now and not later. Nevertheless, this hope is tempered by a sacred fire that is shut up in the prophet's bones that must be articulated even if change is unlikely or improbable. I would be doing y'all a disservice if I didn't give you some type of an example. So one precise example of this quandary that calls forth sermonic militancy is the speech given by Martin Delany, which was directed at Pittsburgh Mayor Hugh Fleming and the largest crowd on record in the city's market house in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, September 30th, 1850, 12 days after the Fugitive Slave Act became law. Considering such an injustice, codified and authorized by a white supremacist governmental order, pleas for unity and moral uprightness, even bold speeches, alone in and of themselves would be insufficient. Something had to be said and done more urgently that could curb the probability of Delany and others like him facing law enforcement sent by Mayor Fleming at his door. Delany exemplified sermonic militancy and turned the market house steps into sacred space. He decried, "Honorable Mayor, whatever ideas of liberty I may have been received from reading the lives of your revolutionary fathers. I have therein learned that a man has a right to defend his castle with his life, even unto the taking of. Sir, my house is my castle, and in that castle are none but my wife and my children, as free as the angels of heaven, and whose liberty as sacred pillars of God. If any man approaches that house in search of a slave, I care not who he may be, whether constable or sheriff, magistrate, or even judge of the Supreme Court. Nay, let it be he who sanctioned this act to become law." Talking about President Millard Fillmore. surrounded by his cabinet as his bodyguard, the Declaration of Independence waving above his head as a banner, and the Constitution of his country upon his breast as a shield, if he crosses the threshold of my door, and I do not lay him a lifeless corpse at my feet, I hope the grave may refuse my body a rest place, and righteous heaven my spirit a home. Oh no, not enter that house, and we both live. End quote. No one from law enforcement ever entered his house. Thank you.
Hey, my is right. My. All right. As promised, these were some wonderful papers, wonderful presentation. We do have plenty of time for some questions, some Q&A. Dr. Frank, I'm gonna give you the opening salvo. If you have a comment or a question that you would like to share with the group before I get to the Q&A that's down there. And please remember, put your questions in the Q&A chat room. We will get to as many as we possibly can and address them as quickly as we can. Dr. Frank, you unmute yourself. There you go.
I'll do a couple and, give other people a chance. I enjoyed all of the presentations, just tremendous insight, and I'm just proud of the scholarship and tremendous growth. I want to start with Pastor Janae and ask her about, it was fascinating, this whole concept of rhetorical signature. By the first time I've heard that phrase, and it really was generative. And I'd like to see you do more work on that. And also, what were some of the rhetorical devices that you so adequately mentioned? You mentioned it several times, that as his, part of heading to his close, his signature rhetorical devices. And I just wondered, had you done work on some of those?
Thank you for that question, Dr. Thomas. C.L. Franklin is so loved and admired and revered by many for a large reason because of how he climaxes his sermons. Mm-hmm. And after sitting in a few of your classes and Dr. Andre Johnson's classes, we've been talking about this idea of close reading and taking a text and delving deeply into the intricacies of a text. Well, as it relates to C.L. Franklin, in many ways, his voice is a text. And I am working on defining, at least as my research is concerned, what it means to practice close listening. There's close listening in other disciplines, but we have not really explored deeply the idea of close listening in rhetoric because we often deal with printed and written texts. But as it relates to C.L. Franklin, his contribution to preaching is so rich because in reality, he's got so much texture in his voice. Mm-hmm. And during what I call close listening, I heard patterns in his climaxes. I heard patterns as he enters his hoop and as he exits his hoop. And in listening closely and in comparing what I heard to the transcripts of his sermons, I was able to detect patterns. And so I was able to detect what his preferred devices are. I did not list them tonight in my presentation because I'm saving them for published research. And so I didn't want to give away all my goods tonight. But I believe Franklin has a a calculated pattern that contributes to what I call his rhetorical signature. And so I appreciate you asking me that question, because for me, it's fascinating. And I can't wait to write a little bit more about it and for it to get out in some published research.
All right, thank you. Thank you. I want to do Richard quickly. Richard, as I was listening to you, to the concept of inclusive rhetoric that you were talking about, I was fascinated because the House managers in their presentation towards Trump were, the conviction of Trump, were using inclusive rhetoric of very similar to what you were suggesting. And Trump's lawyers used a very different kind of rhetoric. So have you given any thought to maybe expanding that analysis to something like, the impeachment, or bring it, Dungy as an example, and then, I realize you're talking about a dissertation, but I just give you what thought and reflection that I had.
Yes, thank you so much for the question. And in the spirit of holding on to some stuff until later, I got to get this little essay done. This 300-page essay I got to write. But I think what is helpful for me as I think about rhetorical criticism, preaching as formation, rhetoric as formation, I see formation occurring in a lot of different ways. And so how do we, Trump as an example of this kind of rhetoric that is divisive. So when you talk about rhetoric, it could be either divisive or inclusive or something in between. So I think that has some opportunity to look over my own dissertation process, but in other ways that it could be included. And as I was editing this paper, the January 6th insurrection rhetoric became a part of it. And I realized I got to take some of that stuff out because now I'm going in a different rabbit hole from the focus of the paper. So I put that over in a file to come back to later. And maybe somebody in our listening audience is interested in this kind of intersectional rhetoric and formation from scholars across the field. So of course we're interested in that. But first, I got to finish this little essay, but I'm open to conversations. Thank you, Dr. Thomas.
Dr. Johnson, I'm going to stop because I don't want to dominate. I got a question for course, Moya and Dr. Fisher as well, but I'm going to pass to the audience. If nobody comes around, then I'll ask those two questions.
Okay. Well, we do have a couple of questions in the queue here, and I'm just going to take them in order. I think this is from Jonathan Murphy, and this is for you, Pastor Janae. After delivering this sermon, did Franklin receive any pushback or consequences from his church? He is also interested if Franklin's distinct changes in the sermon versus prior sermons affected his future sermons. If so, how did it affect him? Like, again, a rhetorical trajectory, so what say you?
First of all, great questions. Thank you for asking those. And I do not know if there was any specific pushback or consequences from his church after this specific sermon. This specific sermon, The Meaning of Black Power, that I lifted today, lands close to like the middle of his pastorate, his years of preaching, because he preached all the way up until the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. And The Meaning of Black Power was in 69. But what I do know is I've got relationship with his church, with New Bethel Baptist Church. It's the church that I was licensed in, ordained in, dedicated in as a baby. And the reputation of C.L. Franklin at the church is one that was very warm and very hospitable to his brand of civic engagement and his brand of political rhetoric. And so I think that at New Bethel, even if he experienced some initial pushback during that time, that he was able to persuade his congregation and shape his audience toward being more hospitable to that language. I have no proof that there was any pushback or consequence from his church for that sermon, meaning of Black power. To your question about his sermons over time and how they may have changed, that is beyond the scope of my research. I would imagine that perhaps one might be able to identify and pinpoint some changes across time. But for right now, my focus is specifically on Franklin's rhetorical signature, the ways his rhetoric comes forth, the structure of it, how it performs. So I have not done anything across the trajectory of his preaching.
All right. And staying with you, Janae, Derek McCullers asking, Black power has to some extent has been identified with electoral politics and economic advancement. Would Franklin be identifying Black power with radical love that is self-affirming and edifies the community, AKA beloved brotherhood and sisterhood?
Great question. Thank you, Derek McCullers, for that question. I would say that particularly as Franklin builds his argument for Black power in his sermon, The Meaning of Black Power, he absolutely affirms a broad understanding of Black power that goes beyond just the political or economic aspects of it. In fact, in this sermon, Franklin says that there are three aspects of Black power. It's emotional, it's psychological, and then it's economic and political. And as he shapes and builds his definition or his conception of Black power, it definitely exceeds and goes beyond electoral politics and economic advancement, as you specify in your question. I would also say that, yes, I believe he would also identify it with radical love and this idea of being self-affirming, as in the beloved brotherhood, because he particularly excerpts Martin Luther King's conversation and rhetoric around the idea of Black power. And in the sermon, C.L. Franklin very much hones in on this idea of self-love, knowing that we are God's children, even though white supremacy and white supremacist theology says that you're a Negro and you're a no good Negro, and Franklin lists all of the negative references that white supremacist ideology places upon the Black person. And then Franklin says, but we are children of God. We are created in God's image. And he goes on to affirm the identity of Black Americans. But I believe, yes, he would identify radical love, radical self-love, and love of others as a part of his conception, given how closely he connects it to the language of Martin Luther King.
All right, great. Nicole McDonald has a question for Richard here. And she's wondering about the Wesleyan Quad as it relates to your research topic.
Oh, absolutely. The Western Quadrilateral is of course, central to any Methodist person, itinerant elder. So he talks about that in other sermons, and I believe that's a part of his theological understanding. The paper did not allow, this kind of permission to explore it in its totality. But by leaning on experience first, certainly list the quadrilateral as part of the ethical argument, or the argument within the church. Is experience a valid claim, or is it scripture first? So it's a part of it ongoing. Thank you for the question, Nicole McDonald. Appreciate you.
Wonderful, wonderful. And Richard, we'll stay with you because Juan Torres has a question. We have seen that ritual tradition has caused more division than race or culture itself. How can a ministry achieve a more diverse church, multicultural, multiracial, and be able to maintain a stable and growing community despite differences? since always the majority group inside the community tends rather to keep power and control?
Wow, we need a whole nother section and lecture to kind of talk about this. But I would just drop it on just this simple place, the role of leadership, and the role that leadership plays both in terms of congregation, pastoral, and as well as those that are lay ministers and clergy and lay people within the congregation. Once you begin to align yourself with leaders who understand the mandate, and then using that as a teaching and learning opportunity, people will come along. But you got to look at it's not an overnight success piece, it's a longevity. So it's going to take time through education, and it falls on leadership. Thank you, Juan, for your question. And I certainly enjoy that. Thank you.
All right. And there is a question for Dr. Earl from Derek McCullers. It seems to me that the Black Lives Matter activists picked up on Dr. King's call for a militant nonviolence. How will you relate this to sermonic militancy? And how does the two compare and contrast in light of this moralism versus militancy divide ascribed within the Black liberation struggle?
Thanks for that. Dr. Johnson, I'm tickled in part. Janae probably remembers this too. When we were in Baltimore and I presented this, the first question shot back is like, so what do we do with Dr. King? It's like the obligatory Dr. King question when you say something about militancy. First, I think it's important to know, as it relates to sermonic militancy, two things that I'm trying to make sure we center in that framework. One is power dynamics, right? And how the power dynamics, oftentimes when we start talking about moralism versus militancy, who has the power within the social political context? So who has the right to use certain types of force, if you will? Because if it's September 11th, don't nobody say, let's be nonviolent, right? When David is about to face off with Goliath, didn't nobody say he needs to be nonviolent, right? And so part of it is this idea that people who are oppressed have to bear the burden of a unjust or equitable type of moralism rooted in that's one part. So the power dynamics is important. Secondly, and this is where I think we sell Dr. King short, right? So usually when we talk about Dr. King and nonviolence, we Pastor Frank writes about this stuff, right? Like we freeze him in a particular span of time, as if the only type of militancy he talked about was nonviolent militancy, which I'm not necessarily sure. So if the other element, or at least one of the elements of sermonic militancy, is the immediacy of the moment, when Dr. King starts talking about the fierce urgency of now, how long, not long, we can't wait, right? These sorts of things. These are militant claims that I don't think he gets enough credit for, which is why I would appreciate doing a close read of his Against Vietnam speech, right? One of the things I think I was talking to Pastor Frank about this, so Pastor Frank did the rhetorical analysis of I've Been to the Mountaintop. I'm like, if you want a dangerous sermon, deal with the Against Vietnam speech. So I think that there are ways for us to break down these rigid, compartmentalized, and dichotomous distinctions between what moralism is and militancy is, because too often I think that we lean way too far into a certain type of moralism. And I think as it relates to the Black Lives Matter movement, part of what they're doing is those distinctions down, such that you compartmentalize them and say they are only leaning into the Black Power movement, or they're only leaning into the Civil Rights movement. They are part and parcel of the broader Black freedom movement. And unless we deal with the wide array of it, I think we'll be selling ourselves short.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. And now a question for Moya from a familiar name, Eugene Gibson. When we speak of the intersection of theology and rhetoric, he asked, and use words like saving my life, the image of the salvific nature of the speech text. Being a hip hop head and rhetorician, what do you see as the salvific nature of the music to be, and what can the church learn from it?
That's a rich question, and that's some stuff that I'm wrestling with, especially with the last paper I was dealing with. But the duality of hip hop, where a lot of people see the negative aspect of hip hop, has to be countered with the life giving aspect, where even where it was birthed out in 1973 during a time of plight after the Black Power movement and after the Civil Rights movement in the Bronx, the 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 people used what they had to do what they could do. They didn't have any instruments, so they made something out of nothing. And I look at that, I can compare that to what God did in Genesis, the making something out of nothing. There's so many aspects of hip hop music. If you look at the life-giving lyrics, that there are some lyrics like especially the women. If you look at Queen Latifah, UNITY, you look at self-destruction that D Nice produced with all during the whole Black on Black crime. This is what's going on in the world. Let's save ourselves moment. There are so many aspects of, see, because I'm an old school hip hop head. So I like, if you ask me the more recent stuff, I still got to do some work on that. And I don't even know if I'm going to delve into that. But because right now some of the work I'm doing is looking at the womanist aspects of the communal nature of the culture, because hip hop is more than just the music. It's the coming together where people of like minds are coming together, whether it's through dance, hip hop, music, graffiti, art, and all of that. I think that the church is missing out on a whole group of people, because you have that hip hop generation, which is really the same thing as Generation X. It's just that generation that affirms and loves hip hop in our age group. That might be a way to get people in the church that are missing right now. So that's just my answer.
Right? Let's stay with you, Moya. Christopher Randall asks, does the false dichotomy of sacred and profane limit liberatory possibilities for evangelism and liberation in the Black church genuinely? Are there forms of proclamation that gets removed from Black theological reflection because of Black adoption of the false dichotomy of the sacred and profane?
I think that the false dichotomy does restrict possibilities of evangelism. I think the fact that we can we can say this music is profane, and so you're basically cutting out a whole group of people. And I dealt with that with my call. When I answered the call in the ministry, I felt like I had to set aside this whole love of hip hop, and I had to reclaim that. And when you start to say that things that people created, especially Black people created, is not sacred, I feel like you're negating a whole group of the population. So I think it does limit us. And what was the second part of the question? The proclamation that gets removed from the Black theological reflection. I do. I think that there are forms that are getting removed. They are not removed because we look at hip hop from a superficial perspective. There's a whole field of study of hip hop and religion where it looks at it from theological perspective. So I think this false dichotomy has done a lot of harm. And we've actually done some Bible study at my church that looks at that false dichotomy.
Great. Dr. Frank, I turn it back over to you. You said you had a couple of more questions, and then we'll get back to some of the Q&A and the question and answers.
Yeah, Moya, what, from your perspective, what might be the resistance to your analysis of Club Quarantine? Where might you see resistance to this, I think, a wonderful articulation that you, but where do you see resistance? Where might you see it?
I think in that dichotomy, the sacred, secular, and the profane, just the fact is hip hop, is there a redemption in hip hop? Going into those spaces, people are talking about all kinds of things. Is God in that space? And I think reminding people that we came from Africa, and this separation, I think that was a big part of my argument that was like an aha moment for me, is that when we came over to North America, there was no separation. We did everything we did had music in it, and we even talk about this at Metropolitan. It's just if Donny Hathaway has a song, that should be in the hymn book. So I think the pushing back, the problem is that I think is that dichotomy that's been a part of the church, because I know there's spaces you cannot play secular music in the sanctuary. There's no way. So the idea that a club, just even the club, and like Save My Life, like Gino said, I could see that pushback, but that just makes me want to push more.
And some of it, it's founded in this whole divine speech versus human speech. That divine speech is sacred, and so also you might be approached with, how do we maintain a Christian distinctiveness in our language when we slide over into making hip hop sacred or making, Black power rhetoric sacred? How do we not lose just for your further thinking, I think that you'll get, and that may be the theological roots of that, as well. So, keep up the good work. I think you're really onto something, and I think it's exciting. And that's why we call the program Black Sacred Rhetoric. That that bringing in rhetoric allows us to expand our definition outside of the boundaries of just Christian rhetoric or religious rhetoric. Is Black sacred rhetoric, which has a tremendous breadth that people think and believe a lot of things to be sacred, which also makes it very dangerous to the Christian traditionalist, because we're losing Christian distinctiveness. And Earl, I really appreciated this sermonic militancy. Most of us, I can't say that, but don't like the word sermonic militancy. And I think you're onto something. And I think that, you have some, I'll argue with you, personally about your putting together Barbara. And I think there's some accuracy in that and your analysis. And I think some of our concern is that we don't use, the weapons of the world to fight the battle, because we end up being just like the people that we're trying to overcome. So that's some of the argument, though. I think your argument pushes us, and respectability politics might be another way to talk about it. And also, I think that this is some of the analysis of Jeremiah Wright, why he hit the taking his remarks out of context, and even when you put them in context, so would you consider that a contemporary example of sermonic militancy?
Yeah, and not just the goddamn America piece either. Samuel Proctor Conference published his speech at the National Press Club. He ended up talking, and Moya, me and Moya had a little exchange about this on Facebook too. I think that when he is laying out like the three elements of a prophetic theology, he said it's a theology of liberation, a theology of transformation, and a theology of reconciliation. There's some militancy in that too, because he's drawing on the social political dynamics of the moment and the immediacy of the moment in light of what was about to happen with Barack Obama. So I do think that he is a example of that too. To your point about using the weapons of the world, if you will, I think that actually gets into what you're trying to tease out with Moya, right? Which, how do we, first of all, let's concede and confess that white evangelicalism drew the lines for us to begin with. See, and so Moya, if we get a chance, I want you to check out Albert Clegg's sermon on Brother Malcolm, where he is arguing that Christianity is much more about praxis than just proclamation, and that Malcolm embodied what it meant to be Christian. See, if you set that up, then all of a sudden these strict lines of demarcation start to be troubled or blurred. And Pastor Frank, I think, or Dr. Thomas, I think that this is part of what makes this conversation necessary and important, because I don't think they being white evangelicalism, actually own the tools in with. So I don't think it's us using their tools, if you will. I think that that's a concession that kind of puts us at a disadvantage, which is why I'm trying to be clear about the need for reform. See, certain people ain't after liberation, they're after assimilation, which causes us to lean into this Jeremiatic appeal for reform.
Yes.
If you mess around and start talking about revolutionary stuff for real, then all of a sudden you're the radical, right? And I'm like, well, I don't know if that's a good, these frames. You did this too in American Dream 2.0 when you were talking about the reason we can't really read Jeremiah right properly is because we're trying to force the Jeremiatic framework on them. So I think I'm trying to tease out some more of that stuff too.
Well, and what he's doing is he's really, what the Jeremiah does not allow you to do is to point structural flaws in the American system.
Yes.
Because what it's saying is that, there are, if we would just be who we said we were, then, we'd be all right. And then, what the kind of militancy that you're talking about said, no, we've got some deep, materialism, racism, militarism, that's king. We've got some deep and profound structural issues here. And folks are not interested in, in talking about that. So I think you're onto something. I just want to, if you can send me a draft I'd love to read it because I think
you got the draft before you got it.
I'm trying to graduate my contemporary students.
That's right. Look, let me say this one thing though, then I'll digress for real, because what you think about something Stokely said. So they were asking Stokely about the efficacy of nonviolence, and he went in through this litany of what the philosophy of nonviolence is, and he says, here's where Dr. King is wrong. He says nonviolence only works when your enemy has a conscience, and America has none.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's what we find out. Yes, I'll disagree with you there. You got other questions, Dr. Johnson? Because
I want to let me get a couple of more before we get out of here because we're running up against time. I do want to get this one that's an open question. It's not directed to anyone, so I guess any of the panelists can answer it. It's from Dion Bossier. I hope I said that right. Can you elaborate a bit more on the inclusive rhetoric, especially as it relates to Black preachers pastoring / serving in predominantly white congregations and sacred spaces? I guess that was Richard, particularly in a time when there are so many calls for unity, peace, and reconciliation. How can we nuance the notion of inclusive rhetoric so that we can still remain true, this is everybody, to the essence of Black sacred and still serve all of God's people and avoid the dangers of losing our own soul in the process? Hallelujah.
So since she mentioned, thank you for the question.
Yes.
And this piece around inclusive rhetoric, it is something I'm still developing as it has evolved out of my own research and thinking. I have not found any scholars that really speak about what it means as I understand it, because I'm specifically looking at through the lens of MBT and Ubuntu and recognizing within the American context, exclusion or inclusive fights against the structural flaws that exist within America. Mm-hmm. And so although it's the US Constitution is a manifest document against Britain as its ideals in order to be free. So it's this public facing document that everybody wants to then come, which then makes the gerrymander false, because when immigrants come, they realize what the founders framed is not the reality on the ground, as first witnessed through the enslavement of Africans. So once we understand and deal with that, then we can begin to talk about the theological mandate that's in Scripture, which Jesus said there's no division and there's one body. What individualism says in America, I believe, which Dr. Frank frames in American 2.0 and other scholars talk about how it is pervasive, and it is in some instances taking over the idea that my success, our success as human beings and flourishing is being diminished by the cultural imperative of pulling myself up by my own bootstraps to the detriment of you. And especially if you or other is someone other than someone who has pale white skin or a lack of melanin. So inclusiveness says, wait, when we look at the scripture, the way that I understand Jesus and following him, Jesus was talking about Jews and Gentiles, people who were once other, but now are included. And so I think that's where inclusive works. And so I'm gonna just leave it there and just say, this is a part of my research dissertation. I can't give it all. And that's my thinking as it is today. I gotta hold on to it, Dr. Frank, because I'm writing for publication.
Just remember too, when you're writing for if you're writing for publication, what you're doing now is a public forum. You have already made claim to your research. So I just want to throw that out as well too. So if anybody gonna come behind you and try to say riff off you without citing you, we got tape evidence.
Show the receipts, Doc. Show the receipts. Show the receipts. Show the receipts.
2021, that you were saying this, and you got over 100 folk in this Zoom room who
Dr. Johnson, it seems like you testifying to something, like you've
right,
been.
that's what I'm saying. So no, I just, I just don't want, don't worry about that. We got you. We got you. Let me see. Wait a minute. Anybody else want to, I think that was a rich question. Anybody else want to jump in and on Dion's question?
What I would say very quickly, and this is an echo of what I'm trying to center in our conversation. Inclusivity is important, but not at the expense of centering the Black experience. And I think too often when we start talking about inclusivity, and I think you're scratching at this too, Richard, some of it is at the expense of the Black experience or Black culture. So let's be mindful of that.
All right. Larry had a question. I think we kind of answered. I think Maury answered that about the sacred, secular confluence and intersection. Let me get to this, to all of the panelists' question down here. Might the way that Anthony Penn redefines African-American religion as the quest for subjectivity over and against how white supremacy seeks to deny it be instructive of your scholarly work? And then he asked the question, in what way? For example, by this definition, hip hop, literature, visual art, and other mediums can be religious expressions. What say you, panelists?
Well, I'll just jump in quickly and say that I think particularly Franklin's sermon that I lifted today, excuse me, called The Meaning of Black Power, very much places Black life at the center of Christian proclamation, or the exploration of God's love, care, and concern for Black people. And so I think that there is absolutely room in my research to affirm that Black people can be the subjects of our research, and of my research in particular, and particularly in Franklin's sermon. I mean, it's called The Meaning of Black Power, and he redefines how Black people can envision themselves despite how white ideology describes and defines them. So much so that Franklin asserts that conception of self is rooted in God and not rooted in a white racist person's description or identification of you. And so, as it relates to subjectivity, yes, I think that there's absolutely space for Black people to be subjects of this research and subjects of this religious enterprise. I'm not sure what other pieces of the question were there, but as it relates to C.L. Franklin, I would say, yes, there is room for subjectivity for Black folks.
All right. Anybody
And I
else?
would jump in and say,
Yep.
yeah, definitely in hip hop, just the whole subjectivity. And I think that's a big part of it, because one of the papers I wrote talked about the ontological nature of hip hop. Like, you're trying to figure out who you are as a hip hop head. You're creating a whole new image based off of Blackness and your situation and your environment. So I would like to look at Anthony Penn and his humanism and more of his works. I would like to include that in my work.
All right. Well, we are 10 minutes away from our time. I want to use these last 10 minutes to just give the panelists, first of all, can we just show a little love for the panelists in your own way, in your chats or whatever? I think I want to thank all of you for participating in this. This is our first symposium. Just want to remind everybody, stay in tune, or stay tuned rather, to the call that's going to be coming out hopefully pretty soon for another one of these type of symposiums where we really wrestle with the African-American rhetoric and public address tradition broadly, but also religious rhetoric more specifically as well. So what I want to do is just go around the Zoom room for our panelists to give you an opportunity just to, real quick, just to say a couple of closing remarks, and I won't call on anybody. I'll let the Spirit lead.
See, so I'm gonna make sure I don't have to go last, because that's how you set me up in the first place. I want to share on this Zoom as my closing remarks some of the comments that we shared this morning on our pre-call, and that is a huge debt of gratitude to you, Dr. Johnson, for trailblazing the road of rhetoric, race, and religion by which all of us are traversing down. Obviously to you as well, Dr. Thomas, and your groundbreaking research that allowed so many scholars to say it is okay to say that there is a wedlock between theology and communication. So I want to thank y'all for what y'all have laid out. I want to salute these wonderful scholars in training who are, for those who hadn't caught the reference, one of my colleagues and friends said that C. Eric Lincoln told him during his dissertation, go ahead and write your little essay. So that's what Richard is referring to, and that's what we hope all of these scholars in training will do, is write their little essay. But thank y'all for allowing me to be a part of this, and I'm deeply grateful for my personal relationships with all of you in our professional network as well. Thanks, Doctor.
Great. Thank you. Who wants to?
I'm gonna come after my Michigan brother. We both have roots from Michigan. So, you know, Dr. Johnson, thank you. Thank you so much for, you know, for this opportunity and for allowing us to bring our scholarship into a different venue. So often scholarly conversations, academic conversations happen in scholarly circles and conferences, but not as often in these kind of virtual platforms that enable non-academic audiences to lean in, to listen in, and to participate. So thank you for allowing this avenue for us to share our research with a broader audience. And I also want to say thank you for offering affirmation for our work in public space as a budding scholar, or as Earl Fisher just called us, scholars in training. You know, it's almost like being hazed, you know, for those folks who are Greek, when your prophytes, you know, anyway. But it is
what is that you're talking about? I don't understand.
right. None of us are part of hazing organizations. But you know, I want to thank you for affirming our scholarship, affirming our work, and making space for us to grow in this area. All of us are ordained preachers, and preaching is our native space, if I can say so about all of us. And it is wonderful to have an opportunity to be affirmed outside of our native preaching space in this academic space. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
All right, thank you.
I'm gonna go before Moya, for she shut it down with DJ Club Quarantine. You got your playlist ready? Cause did you see all the chatter in the box? We need Moya's playlist for DJ
Right.
for Club Quarantine. But again, thank you for the space and the creativity to and the platform for emerging and scholars in training to do something risky but necessary. Sometimes when you let other people hear about your research, it's a place of vulnerability. So thank you for creating a virtual safe space for us, for me, to share our research and our thinking over time. And I just want to give kudos to all of the people who showed up in Indianapolis. It's snowy outside, it may be in where you are as well, but for taking the time to join us today and to think about how preachers think about academic research and how that can be applicable both to the congregation and communities you serve. So I'm thankful for the opportunity to participate.
Right, thank you. And Moya.
He makes me want to like try to spit some lyrics, but I'm not a rapper. So. I was gonna say it's all a dream. I used to read Word Up magazine, Salt and Pepper and Heavy D. But no, I thank you so much for this space and allowing us to be authentic in our own ways. And I thank both of you, Dr. Johnson and Dr. Thomas, for pouring into me, because it was all a dream a couple of years ago to be able to do something like this. So I'm representing J50 cohort. If they're still on, they might be reading some books that Dr. Thomas has assigned us, but a whole lot of books. But I'm grateful for the opportunity. And if you are on Instagram, check out Club Quarantine. But I have moved on to the Fast Auntie Lounge of Ninth Wonder, because he's really, really my space of healing while I write my papers.
All right, thank you. And Dr. Frank, we'll give you a quick word.
Nothing more to say, but just excited about these rhetorical possibilities and the whole again, the rhetorical side of theology. Rhetoric lets you go anywhere. I mean, you can rhetorically read anything, because most things are seeking to persuade. And so how I initially got into the PhD program, I was teaching a class. This is last word testimony. I was teaching a class in preaching, and Andre Johnson took the class, didn't you? You took the
I was Alderton, I think.
Okay,
I was just sitting in there.
I couldn't fail you. That's why I couldn't fail you. And he told me about this program that he was going to engage in over at the University of Memphis in Rhetoric. I said, where? And so from his lead, I followed up, and we both entered in the same year. So I'm just thankful to him and for all the years of working together, and what the future holds and what has come to be. So thank you, man. You're doing a fabulous job. And many of us would love to be the scholar that you are, and not only the scholar, but to be able to communicate with wide groups of people across Twitter, across Instagram. I mean, so you're doing this thing. So keep doing it. And you got my full support, 100,000%.
Oh, man, thank you. That means a lot. And that means a lot coming from all of you and all of the folk that are in the Zoom room, in the webinar. Thank you for coming. I want to shout out real quick, Brother Nathan Brasfield. Y'all show him some love. He set this up for us. He's been monitoring everything, making sure that we're still on. Dr. Pete Gackey, the dean, academic dean at Memphis Theological Seminary, on all the wonderful people there. President Jody Hill, who was on earlier. Shout out to Dean Francis of CTS, Christian Theological Seminary. I see some J50 still on, and the first cohort still on. So I am just so thankful again for all of you for participating. Remember, you're going to be hearing from us. You're going to be seeing us on Facebook. Some of you have been sent an invitation to join our Facebook group. We're going to try to do a group, and we are going to stay in contact. You can just tell us, look, I don't want to mess with y'all no more. Just let me know, then we won't mess with you no more. But we do want to stay in contact because we will have another call coming out real soon. And we want to have a couple of more of these type of symposiums as we prepare for the conference a little bit later on this year in November in Seattle, Washington, NCA, RCA. We want to go to AAR as well as the Academy of Homiletics. So we are trying to get a group of scholars together, because one of the things that I wanted to do, and I thank you for the shout outs, and I'll be real quick with this. I intentionally have done this type of work, meaning that I went into this knowing, I remember my mentor and just awesome friend and guide, the Reverend Dr. Barbara Holmes, telling me that this, you're going to somehow create this path. And I don't know how I was going to create it, didn't know what I needed to do or whatever, but I did intentionally want to build upon the legacy of Michael Leff, our advisor, who saw African-American religious communication as a valuable and bona fide research agenda, and the whole rhetoric, race, and religion, as Dr. Fisher mentioned, I think earlier, I know today, and then maybe even this evening, and how all of this kind of came together. I wanted to intentionally create space for people to do this type of work. There is a bridge from the church to the academy, and it's no longer helping people to see that, helping people or building that bridge. It is now helping people to see that the bridge is already there. We are moving back and forth from it all the time. It's recognizing now that this is major. Religious rhetoric, religious communication is major. And if January the 6th didn't teach us anything, it taught us that studying religious discourse matters. And it matters because our politics is tied up in it. Our foreign policy is tied up in it. The way that we govern is tied up in it. And if we are embedded in a white theological paradigm, and if that's what we are operating out of, trying to figure it all out without being critical, without doing the critical analysis that Dr. Earl and that Janae and Richard and Moya and Dr. Frank and others have been doing to try to unearth that, we are just going to be spinning our wheels in the mud. So what rhetoric, race, and religion, and the study of religion, if we understand, if you don't understand anything else, you understand that religion is a discourse made up by humans that can be studied rhetorically. That's all you really need to do. And when you begin to understand that, then you can start to unpack, and you can begin to understand what it is, what's really going on as we try to hide behind our language and hide behind our words. You can kind of unearth that and expose that. And that is the beauty of the study of rhetoric. It is the study of messaging. It's the study of persuasion, yes, but it's also the study how we craft words, as Leff called it, art, how we craft the art as it relates to our public speaking and our writing. So with all of that being said, thank you again, and be on the watch out and the lookout. Nathan is going to have this up on the seminary website in a couple of days. And this will be planned throughout on social media throughout the week. So catch it. If you didn't catch all of it, you can catch it again. And please share it. Please share it with all of your social media friends. All right. With that being said, thank you for being here. And thank you again. And be on the lookout. The call is coming soon.
Good night.
Good night.